All right, so thank you, everyone for attending. I know this is the day before Thanksgiving, so I'll hopefully keep things pretty light today. We'll just be going through homework five, and I have one or two more examples that like mostly homework five, sort of examples built around there. So I'll hopefully keep things pretty light. And but to start out, the as I was mentioning before, for most of you who are already here, are there any questions on the proposal feedback? Everyone who submitted should have received that feedback already. So if anyone hasn't, if definitely let me know. But any questions otherwise? And for the proposal feedback, I ended up including information on just sort of a target for assignment six. For the proposals overall were really great, and the the there was like for most of the proposals, I was able to sort of point to a few things that could be worked on for assignment six. So I tried to, really aim to, sort of predict what sort of, what what in my opinion should be sort of focused on, fleshed out before beginning the final. And then we're sort of using assignment six to really be geared towards your final project. So by kind of having these multiple touch points, I'm hoping that we the fear is if you sort of locate your data source, sort of start to plan out what you'd like to do, and realizing at the last minute that your data is not um, is not sort of going to work the way that you want it to. Perhaps there's and just to mention um, a few things. I've sort of mentioned a few people sort of doing geographic data, and who want to incorporate maps. Most people were looking more at sort of county or state level data, but this is sort of a general theme I've noticed among my classes is when you are dealing with different geographies, you have to think pretty hard about how sort of the geographies fit together, and even with something that seems as innocuous as metro level data. It's metros cross state lines. Metros are usually pretty good with counties. Like they're usually defined as a group of counties, so they play pretty well with that sort of data. So that's sort of one common theme, and then really just kind of general cases of either the you know either sort of looking at the data sources would sort of need to be geared towards for assignment six, or other more general things to really focus on. So if there aren't any questions, and if there are, put them in the chat and I'll address them, or email me and we can talk offline. But otherwise, so I assume everyone got their their assignments back. So everyone should be on track for that. And then with homework five in, the rest of the class is pretty much assignment six and the final project, which are both geared towards sort of working on your final project in stages. So hopefully, so pretty much we're in the we're reaching the end of the course, and everyone really should be shifting gears to work on their final projects. So with that, I haven't shared my screen yet, but let me do that now. And is everyone seeing Adam with JS homework solutions?
Yep.
Cool. Perfect. Thanks. This is my first time doing this with a multiple monitor setup, and I know that you could get caught with different monitors there, but it seemed pretty straightforward. So let's dive into this then. So let me just pull up the homework. So first we'll just look at the PDF. So this one, I had a few parts and asked everyone to work on 2 out of the 3. And this is sort of, each part was meant to incrementally get a bit more a bit more complex in terms of JavaScript. So it's really just about how to sort of how far along you would like to go for the assignment. So I'll go through a few potential solutions here. So first, I just have everything on one page here, and for the first 2 parts, I just to kind of keep things in line, everything is just in the same HTML file. So we'll be just sort of looking at the JavaScript within the scripts like this. So let's go through the problem. So these are the 4 questions for the for sort of the first 2 parts of homework 5, and these should be very these 2 parts were pretty similar to the examples that we were going through last week. So sort of just kind of doing things just simple string manipulation, and then sort of as we get to 3 and 4, using D3 to sort of work with HTML elements to sort of get everyone acquainted with how that would work in using tools like D3 or Plotly or other visualization packages. So with something like this, we just have first displaying the reverse word, and you could see how these are being done here. So we have just empty divs that we're pointing to for where we're going to put the answers, and we're sort of have our helper functions writing to the DOM and just simply reversing any strings, and then really tying that in with this onClick action here. So using just standard HTML form and calling that function whenever the button is clicked. So pretty straightforward and pretty similar to what we've been seeing in other what we were seeing last week. And then for part 2, we're doing sort of we're building a more complex element, but it's still pretty similar to what we still pretty similar to like what we've been going over in previous classes. So being able to go into these functions and just simply create elements based off of that. So here you could see that we're just sort of looping through, as I've mentioned in the past, sort of working with JavaScript, especially raw JavaScript. There's a lot that you really have to do manually. So it's just sort of a matter of looping through, sort of looping through different sort of number of elements, and adding, sort of building your table sort of one block at a time in that way. So, we're sort of using this to run that for loop and getting our multiples, and then just simply writing to the table. And then similar to before, we had this, this div that we were pointing to here. So as we get to the more D3 sort of focused questions, so those were just kind of simple, pretty standard, simple JavaScript functions, and with the next two questions, we sort of move into places where we would be using D3. In this case, we're not really visualizing data yet, but we're using D3 to sort of build these elements. So basically here we're just reading in our CSV. And actually, first, let's just look at what we have here. So basically, all we're doing is converting a CSV to a sort of, in this case, just pretty unstyled table. And to do that, we're using some some of the very similar strategies that you would use if you were sort of using D3 for visualization purposes. So you have these basically the pattern that I was going through last week, where you sort of select all, you link it to the data, use enter and append, and then sort of adding your various elements. So either adding inner text, or in some of the examples that we were working with 2 weeks ago, adding things like attributes or other sort of attributes for other things within D3, within the HTML tags rather. So we're just sort of building the header here, adding sort of our t head and tr and th tags, and then just looking at the rows over here. So let's take a look at what this ended up looking like. So here we'll go into, and where's question 3? So just as before, we had sort of an empty div that we were pointing to. So we have our third div right here. And then the table is just being inserted within it. So you could see sort of the, and as I'm hovering over, obviously you could see sort of the different elements show up. So you have this sort of different header elements, the row that is representing the header row, and then each of the rows, and within these, each of the cells within it. So so that's that's basically just happening by looping through the data. So for the header, the first thing that we're looking at is columns, which I just defined over here. So technically, I'm not using the CSV for that portion, and then for the rows, that's where we're linking to the CSV data. So we're adding the rows and adding the cells separately. So for so basically, for each of the rows, we're just appending these TRs, and then appending the TDs within within each row. And actually, with this, you could see that I'm using, and what I'll actually do is I'll console log this thing so that we could take a look at what we're looking at. Actually, how do I want to do this? Or you know what? We'll just sort of focus on the on what's happening here. So similarly to working, with sort of the text and attributes, where in order to show values, we are sort of using these callback functions. You could have callback functions within each of the within the data if you want to represent the data in a different way. So here you could see, we're sort of mapping based off of these rows. So data, we're iterating through each row, and we're sort of getting the sort of using this to sort of get sort of map with each of sort of get the values that we want. So sort of looking at the column and then returning the row column. So sort of columns. I think I should be able to do this. Should be able to just console log this guy. And let's see if that shows up the way I want. Yep, and Natalie asked if I could post the last meetups. I've uploaded them to YouTube. I just so pretty much right after the this and the second session meetup, I'll post those. But absolutely, the yeah. So it would definitely help with sort of if you are choosing to use these tools for like anything JavaScript for the final project. So let's look at what we have in the, oh, and yeah, it's because I'm, so I'm not going to focus on that for now. But basically, what we're doing is, it's essentially a nested for, well, not a nested for loop. We're sort of using this, map function with JavaScript, and we're just sort of getting arrays of the values within each row. And when we do that, we end up with, as we were seeing it, there we are. As we were seeing it, we end up with a table like so. And this is just console logging the data that is, so this is what the raw data looks like as it's coming in. So any questions on 3 before we move on to 4? Cool. So question 4 is very similar. It's using the same data, very similar to question 3, but in this case, we are linking this to some user input. So now that we have, now that we're working with the data, we would like to allow users to, type in a president and get the and return that president's height and weight. So, if I enter in Clinton, we get the Bill Clinton's height and weight there. And that is happening over here. So again, similarly as before, we have sort of our input, and we're using this form to get the information, and and then sort of referencing the function that we're running with this onClick attribute. And then what is that function doing? It's actually handling the CSV call. And again, like similarly to previous exercises, there's there's you kind of have to do things at a pretty low level. So literally, what we're doing is just sort of going through the sort of looping through the data and just simply checking if so we're using this here to reference the value of what's in the form here. So the name is presinfo. That's how we're getting that. The input type here, presname. That's what we're referring to here, and then just referencing the value. And all we're really doing is sort of looping through the data and checking if the name equals what's in the what was typed in there. If it is, using this select output, and then using that same helper function that I wrote before, just writing the selected output to the DOM. And then that's all that's happening here. So any questions on that before we move on to part 3? Cool. So let me get to part 3. And so for part 3, you'll, this is pretty similar to the Flask example that I had included in the course GitHub 2 weeks ago. Pretty much just built off of that that same example with a few minor tweaks. And so basically, with this third example, we're sort of building off of module 4.5, where we were just sort of building a Flask API based on the trees API that we were working with in assignment 4. And so what I ended up doing with my example, and obviously, like, I left it pretty open-ended, so this is just sort of one example of what could have been done here. And what I and one thing that I sort of wanted to use this also as an excuse to show off is using multiple JavaScript packages. So I'm actually using both Mapbox and Plotly, and I'll also talk a bit about cross filtering, which is sort of one strategy in terms of user interaction, and sort of something simpler that I ended up sort of implementing here. So let's go into, hold on 1 second. Cool. So just like, so first, before I go into the page, just to refresh everyone on the structure of what I was building here. So similarly to before, we're just using Flask to to actually to pretty much handle the entire app, to render our HTML template, and also to provide the JavaScript that we're to provide the JavaScript that we're using on top of Flask. So let's look at what I did here, and then we'll dive into the code. So so Plotly has a Mapbox feature, like you are able to use that as a trace type. But just to sort of show how something slightly more sophisticated than the examples we've been going through before would be implemented, I wanted to use the Mapbox GL library, which is sort of the Mapbox's own raw JavaScript library. And so what I ended up doing for this is so first thing you'll see, there's no and obviously like this is pretty unstyled, but in terms of like just the app itself, there's no obvious sort of places for a user to interact. And what I'm actually doing is sort of using one visual element to sort of power the other. So what I'm actually doing here is just taking in the so the sort of question that one would answer with an app like this is essentially being able to go into different areas, to click into different areas of New York, get a sort of small radius around the. I tried to make it so it's like around 10 Manhattan streets, and get so like sort of a small radius around around wherever you click, and be able to return sort of the most populous tree species within those neighborhoods. So you're able to explore the map and get different distributions of different tree species. And this kind of interaction is pretty commonly referred to as cross-filtering. And so, so far, a lot of the examples that we've been looking at, they really revolve around the sort of user using things like drop downs, using these different web controls to interact with a visualization. So user makes choices, those choices sort of get fed into callback functions and display a visualization based on what users are selecting, however they're selecting it. But in this case, what we're doing is actually using the sort of using one visualization to power the other. And this is like the way that I'm actually doing it here. This is a more sort of pretty use case specific way of interacting. There's sort of sort of a unique question that one is asking, and sort of looking at sort of having a custom function, in this case just sort of a geographic filtering of trees, and showing that in a plot here. And the only reason I sort of bring that up is because usually like another common way that people will often refer to cross-filtering is sort of the concept of drilling down. So actually one of our examples here, there we are. And I want to go down to this energy example. So this is sort of a more, commonly like what I would call a more common sort implementation of cross filtering. You could, and in this way, you could almost think of cross filtering as being either sort of the concept of drilling down, which you're sort of using one graph to filter the data input of another graph, or alternatively, you could sort of think of this like almost similarly to database sort of merges in like joins in databases, where you're you're sort of using the cross filtering, like you have two sort of relational tables feeding them, and the cross filter interaction could almost be comparable to a join. So using something like this as an example, we have a bunch of this is kind of similar to really any of those two characterizations, where you're sort of filtering, you're using this hover action to filter. You're sort of hovering over a well and sort of filtering your production curve database based on the well that's selected. Alternatively, you could think of that as joining. You have sort of a production table where everything is together, and you're sort of relating that to what you're choosing here. So that's sort of the most common way that you could use cross filtering. But because we're working and in a lot of like tools like Tableau or other like more GUI oriented tools, cross filtering like this would be more created using logic like that. But because we're using Python and JavaScript, you're able to really fine tune what you're doing with your really fine tune what you're doing with your callback. So here, when users are interacting with the map, this is a bit harder to really to really sort of like it's harder to map onto that sort of logic. If that makes sense. So let's dive into the code of what what this is, and then we'll look at a couple more examples of cross filtering. So so it turns something like this, because the interaction is relatively straightforward. It's we're not there's not too much code, which will sort of hopefully make things easy as you guys are using these examples as sort of rubrics for your final project. So what are we doing? So basically, first we're like with Mapbox, you need to sort of register for a free access token, and we're defining our map like so. And pretty much every like Mapbox has some pretty good documentation. Let's see. Like I find it pretty useful to just go through the examples here and really and sort of use this to sort of use this as a jumping off point if you guys are using more geographically focused data. So in this case, for example, like I was just looking at I wanted. I forget the exact example I wanted, but most of the time with Mapbox, you're using layers, and you'll be so here, for example, you're just simply drawing 2 points on the underlying map, and you'll see examples of how something like that is done. So you have this add layer function, but for the purposes of my app, I wasn't doing that. I was simply recording click events on the map itself. So let's look at how this is happening. So first, looking at the Flask app, I slightly tweaked what I was using for the endpoint. So you'll see I'm just using this endpoint. I'm sort of just using a single endpoint rather than sort of what I was doing before with sort of with kind of naming my variables within the within the string here. And so I'm only including this one endpoint, yet I am still getting information from sort of latitude and longitude information that's being passed in on the JavaScript side. So basically, I'm using these functions here. This request, it's sort of one of the functions coming in from Flask, and I'm using this to get sort of these arguments. So you can see here that URLs like this are, and if you're anywhere around the modern internet, you've seen URLs that look like this. All you're doing is sort of adding a query string to it. So you have this question mark, and you're sort of defining what variables you want to pass in. And I could, pass in however many variables I want without changing this. It just might not use it. In this case, it's expecting a latitude and longitude. And the way that I'm defining the sort of radii, it's not sort of the I mean, it totally works for purposes like these. There are sort of more robust ways of sort of filtering things geographically in this way, sort of either looking at sort of a polygon and getting points within a polygon, or so you could sort of define your circle and get points within there. But all I'm doing is just essentially providing, like, by just looking at these like latitude minus the difference, latitude plus the difference, all I'm doing is getting sort of a latitude and longitude base square. Not sort of the most like, for obviously, like looking at a city level like this, it works fine. If you're working with larger areas, you'll want to watch out for thing. You'll end up with sort of shapes that aren't squares, because the lines of longitude don't stay constantly the same distance from each other. But for the purposes of this, it'll work to get us what we sort of roughly what we want. And then other than bringing in the variables in a different way, it's very similar to what we were sort of working with what we were working with in modules 4 4.5 and 5. So during the last 2 lectures. So we're sort of building our URL based on these templates. So we're just sort of formatting that with our sort of bounds in terms of longitude and latitude. Building our URL like this, we're using we didn't really sort of get into the specific, sort of the, this specific with SOQL, but SOQL has this between function, which lets you just sort of numerically look between ranges. So that's what we're doing here, grouping by the species, and then just getting this. I'm doing the ordering within SOQL as well, ordering by descending, and just simply getting the and sort of building my query that way. So once I read this in, it's basically very similar to what we were getting before. The data is already in the shape that we want. We have our we have our species. We have counts of each of those species. So that's all we need there. And then we're just building the Plotly object. Again, like before, we're using sort of, even though we are in Python, we're building this in the form that it would be in with JavaScript. So, you'll notice if you go to the JavaScript help pages, you'll see, it's very similar to what you would see in Python, since dictionaries are just that close to JSON. But just like you don't have a concept of graph objects, so you have to include this type. That's really the main thing. And then just sort of another pitfall to watch out for is I always, and you pretty much have to always convert your data frame like filters to lists, because JSON is a simpler data type, and so if you're sort of including datetime objects, you sort of might have to work with those as well. But so basically, I built my API to do all the work for me. I'm building my Plotly figure and returning, using JSONify the figure itself, and that's all. That's just very simply where this is coming from, and so that's the output. We could then go to the JavaScript side to look at to sort of get an idea of the input. So this right here is just simply defining where our map is, and you'll see lots of examples like this in the Mapbox documentation. You pretty much they all start with just sort of naming your container. So in this case, we have the map div over here, and choosing your style, and then your center and zoom. So we sort of get all of those settings. And then we have this this over here, which is with Mapbox, how you add an event listener. So this I'm actually not sure why Mapbox really prescribes doing this Mapbox on load. There's probably some asynchronicity issues that that is being done there, but you sort of put everything inside this this map.onload. Like even in the example we brought up here, you'll see you're pretty much including everything in this map.onload. And I was just doing originally a lot of console logging here, but really what I'm really the logic of this is what's happening over here. So we have sort of this second map.on where we're targeting an event, in this case clicks. And I'll add back just this so we are able to see what gets console logged there. So let me refresh this. So you could see, and I think this is just the what's being returned. Yeah, I have another console log there. So when you click, you get an object that looks like this. So you just sort of get a lot of information about the click event, in particular the latitude and longitude, and that's what I'm referencing here. So the sort of data returned with the click event. There's a lot included in that object. Here I'm just accessing the latitude and longitude, and I'm using I'm essentially building my Flask API here. So I have my trees API, and I'm sort of just building the string, like getting my lat and long. That is then getting passed here, where the tree graph is getting built. So here I'm just reading it in with Plotly with d3.json, which again, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, is exactly the same as plotly.d3. Like Plotly just comes with its own wrapper around d3, and then I'm using this right here, plotly.react, which essentially means just if there's no graph there, it'll plot a new plot. If there is a graph existing, it'll sort of more efficiently just add new data to the existing plot, which is pretty much what we would like with something like this. So that's pretty much all that's happening. All that's happening here. You could see, like with something like Mapbox and Plotly, we could mix and match those. With JavaScript, and pretty in a pretty like straightforward way, we were able to get cross filtering to happen. So to be able to get this sort of interaction between visualizations. And in terms of Plotly, I'll point you guys to this here, the event. So just Plotly/JavaScript, and this here, the event reference. This is essentially the Plotly version of what I was doing with Mapbox. So if you are using Plotly.js, you have these things, like you could see here, there's Plotly click, and it's sending an alert once I've clicked on these. And similarly to what was happening with Mapbox, we return information about that click. So we're able to sort of access the points here. So I'll just sort of like point this out for people who are using Plotly.js, and then on the Dash side, this functionality is built into Dash, so you're able to go to just this part 5 here, interactive graphing and cross filtering, and this shows off how to how to sort of do the same thing entirely within Dash. And this goes through sort of the different the same types of event types that you would see with Plotly.js. So things like zooming and relayout, and selecting data. So we're approaching the end here, and I didn't have much, like just sort of wanted to go through those few examples. So any questions before we sign off for the night? Cool. So hopefully everyone should be clear on what's expected for the rest of the course. So pretty much start focus on your final projects for this last month or so. And the with our we have two more meetups, but the last meetup is going to be purely devoted to students sharing their final projects. So we just sort of have one more meetup like this. And Chunhui asked, Chunhui, is this in reference to the final project? Okay, yeah. So basically, with the final project, I'm leaving it very open-ended. You could use you could use sort of Shiny or Dash, or if you're choosing sort of what we've been focusing on towards the latter part of the course, sort of these different JavaScript libraries, D3, Mapbox. You could choose any iteration of any iteration of those. So really like what I would sort of think about like what you're looking to do. Like if it is more geographically focused, you could use Mapbox. You could just simply use Plotly's wrapper of Mapbox. There are other geographic libraries out there like Leaflet or Carto. And so I did sort of go through a lot of information, but this is more sort of just meant to really really sort of just let everyone know what's out there, and then sort of allow everyone to make the correct choice for what they're doing. But for the final project, like if you choose to just do just like if you're just using Shiny or a Dash on its own, that's totally acceptable for the final project. Those sorts of like Shiny and Dash, like those are really sort of your one-stop shop. So the one thing I would mention is if you are using Shiny or Dash, that's sort of your framework. So you're sort of uh, you're using that framework. So for example, like if you're using Dash, your visualization library that you're using would be Plotly, and it's you're not as of yet able to easily draw other D3 visualizations. So sort of think about what types of visualizations you would like for your final project, and use that to guide your choice of tools. Any other questions? Yep, Chinhui, I'll make sure it is posted soon. I mentioned the last two that I owe you guys is they're both already uploaded to YouTube. So I just need to post those links, which I'll do right after I sign off with the section two meetup. Cool. So unless there are any other questions, thank you everyone for coming here on the last day before hopefully a long weekend for everyone. And I hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving or happy holidays. All right. Good luck, everyone. Cool. So I'm just going to leave this open for section two. So everyone from section one, feel free to sign off. And if anyone has come yet from section two, good evening. We'll pick this up again in about 15 minutes.